Let me start with a true story. As Mr. Murthy mentioned that I became Minister for Information and Broadcasting at a time when the UPA was possibly passing through its worst credibility crisis. And therefore, I was a rookie minister who had never ever served in government. I was a first-time member of parliament. And there I was as the Minister for Information and Broadcasting, not really knowing the A or the Z of government communication. Yes, I had by then done political communication for about 5 years, which in fact entails trying to abuse your opponents at the top of your voice every night and hope that it passes off as reasonable communication. So I spent the first month, as all ministers do or should do, trying to learn about what really is the length and breadth of my remit, and from where to where does my empire extend. And after going through a fairly rigorous exercise for about 1 month, the Prime Minister was then traveling to my constituency, Ludhiana, to address, if I remember correctly, the Silver Jubilee Convocation of the Punjab Agriculture University. And since I was the local member of parliament, so I, kind of tagged along and got a seat in the plane. So he asked me when we were flying to Ludhiana, he says, so what's your experience been so far? So I said, sir, with great respect, if I may venture to suggest that this government, or for that matter any government, it neither requires a Minister for Information and Broadcasting and nor requires a Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. I think if we can do away with these paradigms, we would be actually doing ourselves a great service. And the reason why I made that statement was because in the first month itself, I realized that when hierarchy collides with anarchy, it produces chaos. Government is hierarchy. The vast expanse of media is anarchy in motion. And when the two of them have to interface, and they do all the time 24/7, because 90% of the news actually emanates out of government. So you, at the best of times, have a complete chaos on your hands. So he told me, he says, so what is the model that you have in mind? So I said, sir, what government requires is a full services communication agency which can go across print, broadcasting, and the new media, and it should function on an outsourced model. Prasar Bharati, which is supposed to be the public broadcaster, should be really made autonomous and put under a parliamentary committee, as the Prasar Bharati Act mentions. Or you repeal the act and government should take Doordarshan and All India Radio back to themselves, because this half autonomy, half control has completely and absolutely crippled Prasar Bharati. It's an organization which has not been able to, unfortunately, deliver to its remit, primarily because of the inherent structural issues which are there. And so therefore, over a period of time, since in the past 2.5 years, I've been writing my second book about the 10 years of UPA. The first one was really a compilation of stuff that I had earlier written over those 10 years to try and tell a narrative of those times. I had the opportunity of very deeply thinking about some of these issues, going and revisiting some of the decisions that I had taken, some of the issues which I had to deal with. And every time I came back firmly convinced that the structure of government communication fundamentally needs to be altered. I recall when I called my first meeting of the PIB officers from across the country. I wanted to sit down and have a chat with them. And to my horror, I realized that they were the principal nodal information officers of the Government of India, but the Government of India hadn't even given them a mobile phone. So therefore, in this day and age, you had information officers who were using their own mobile phones, who were using their own private emails in order to try and disseminate, schemes or propaganda or whatever you would like to put that nomenclature as to the people. And in any case, the footprint is very thin. The footprint of the central government, the budget of the central government, I think the budgets of some of the state governments also, leaving aside Delhi, which has an information budget which is triple that of the central government, you have a serious problem in terms of the entire structure of government communication. And the difficulty is that in the past 20 years, the entire landscape has completely and absolutely transformed itself. As we speak, there are 105,000 odd print publications in India. There are about 892 odd television channels when there was just one in 1991 or 1992. And out of them, you have the 891 private television channels. There are 389 news and current affairs channels and 492 non-news and current affairs channels. And cable and satellite television gets across to 175 million homes, which roughly translates into 900 million people. Now here comes the catch. If you go by figures which are publicly available, 93% of this entire television universe does not watch news. It only watches entertainment channels. Only 7% of the people actually watch news and current affairs channels. So you have 400 odd chaps, national, regional, local, kicking around in 7% of the space, trying to get a revenue model going, which is completely dependent upon eyeballs, which is measured by a totally faulty paradigm called TRP, which now has been replaced by BARC, which then becomes the measure as to how 25,000 crores of advertising revenue is apportioned across the space. So there is an inherent problem in the back end of the media, the broadcasting media to begin with. Ultimately, they are not in the business of charity. They are in the business of business. Media business, like any other business, has its bottom lines, it has its profits, it has its shareholders, and eventually they are, if in case you are a listed company, accountable to the market in a certain sense of the word. So you have this extremely hysterical, sensational, cat eat cat, cat eat dog, dog eat dog, mongoose eat snake, snake eat mongoose kind of a discourse which goes on a daily basis, primarily because we have not been able to build subscription models in the broadcasting space, which was the entire intent of digitization. When my predecessor, Mrs. Ambika Soni, introduced digitization, the entire object was to see if we can build a sustainable revenue model whereby a certain amount of subscription revenue starts flowing back to the broadcasters, because most of it was monopolized earlier by the local cable operators. Now there's a bottleneck at the level of the multi-system operators, so that this discourse can, to some extent, get moderated. And of course, there are certain very honorable exceptions to this rule, who, notwithstanding the revenue model, would continue to remain as sensational as they were yesterday. And but broadly, what I found was, and which is the difficulty that you have to confront with in the most, because development news, policy making is not sexy. It does not make news. But, if a minister, unfortunately, is possibly caught driving on the wrong side of the road, maybe for all the right reasons, he maybe thinks at night that he's in the US and not in India, that definitely would make, big news. So there is a fundamental problem that you have at the back end, which till the time it is not addressed, the space for government communication is going to be a very narrow sliver in the larger media space. Similarly, if you look at print, and then if you come down to numbers, the largest news channel, English news channel in India, which terrorized a lot of governments over a period of time, actually reaches out to 0.01% of the people only. And these are not my figures. These are the figures given to me by the guys who actually own that channel. Not run it, but actually own it. The largest Hindi channel actually reaches out to about 0.63% of the Indian population, if I've got the number right, and I've got it somewhere here. So in terms of reach as opposed to impact, most of these so-called national news channels really have a minuscule reach. They may have larger impact in terms of their ability to terrorize governments, but it is the local, or it is the regional channels which actually have the bulk of the viewership, even in those 7% who actually watch news and current affairs. Now, if you come to print, the combined print circulation in this country reaches out to only 14% of the people of India. So, 86% of the people of India do not have access to a newspaper or do not read a newspaper. And Malayalam Manorama, Daily Thanthi are the bigger circulating newspapers, in the regional space. Dainik Jagran in the Hindi space. Times of India, of course, dominates the English space, but 84% of the space is still vacant. So, contrary to what is happening around the world, where iconic print publications have been closing down, because of growing literacy in India, you will find that there is a lot of scope for print publications to expand, possibly if they get their model right, because there is a lot of competition from the digital media because of the proliferation and spread of mobile telephony and the access to the internet which it brings along with it. So it's a very dynamic, evolving media space, which, given the constraints of government hierarchy, governments, whether they are state governments or whether they are central governments, are completely incapable of dealing with. Because the response time which is required is simply not there given the nature of government decision making. I set up the new media wing in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. In fact, effectively turned it into the Ministry of Information, Broadcasting and New Media. Now, the social media or the internet was the most audacious experiment in anarchy. And it has succeeded. Today, the internet represents the largest ungoverned space on planet Earth. And never in the history of humankind has so much power concurrently resided on so many fingertips. There is more data which is churned out every 2 days than from the dawn of civilization till the turn of the 20th millennium. So what you have is really a tale of two civilizations. A physical civilization which evolved over the millennia, and a virtual civilization which is evolving. And the future of humanity is actually going to lie, or humankind is actually going to lie, at the intersection of these two civilizations. You may have a situation tomorrow that while you have physical countries, Westphalian states, you may have virtual countries. Countries which are there in the virtual world. Countries which are recognized by physical Westphalian states. So, under these circumstances, those who operate within the physical constraints of a Westphalian state are dealing with a phenomena which knows no barriers, no boundaries. The Facebook lands and the Twitter lands are much bigger in reach and influence than any country. So that's why I'm saying that a serious attempt must be made across government space to reimagine the universe of government communication in the context of this changed landscape. Now, Government of India has a Department of Field Publicity. Now, the DFP did excellent work at one point in time. They would show movies, they would go out to the villages, etc., etc., etc. But in a country which has 632,000 villages, when we were doing the Bharat Nirman or the India Story campaign, I found that the DIPP could at best reach out to 2 villages in a state during the whole campaign, or 3 villages in a state. And because, you see, the need for physical communication is no longer there. So you have to completely reorient units like DIPP, the Department of Field Publicity, the Song and Drama Division, to actually make them tech savvy and start using the means of communication which go across to the larger section of people at the minimal of cost. So you have structures in government, like for example, we have the photo division which has some of the most amazing archival material which is available. But the photo division in today's day and age is a redundant relic. It has to be consigned to the golden frames of history. And I can go on chapter and verse about, now everybody asks me this question that, why didn't you do all this when you were minister? Because, as I was telling you, my job in the last 1.5 years was to try and see what best I could make out of the UPA story. That actually took 80% of my time. This 20% which I'm talking to you about was incidental learning. You know, is the time that I got beyond my propaganda pursuits trying to be Goebbels to actually really learn about my ministry. And what I learned, convinced me that the information departments of the state or the central government should act as that nodal interface between the private entity, which is given the responsibility of government communications, and the DIPR, which provides them the inputs in real time. Now, even in terms of inputs, when I would ask my PIB officers, they said, sir, we are the last to know as to what happens in our ministry, because they are not seeded into the decision-making process. I mean, till the time somebody doesn't have excellent personal PR, he's an outsider to the ministry, the secretary or the joint secretary, forget the minister, does just not have the time for him. So if any journalist was actually to call him up and ask him, hey, your ministry took this decision, the poor guy doesn't know, because he's not been told. I mean, all his job is to possibly put out a press release at the end of the day if he's told. So that's why we started making an effort. I started telling my ministerial colleagues, please seed them into the decision-making process. Whenever you have a senior officers meeting, please ensure that they are present for all the weekly meetings. At least they know what is going on in the ministry which they are supposed to be servicing. Which brings me to another question, that whether this country actually requires an Indian information service or not. I mean, the Indian Information Service has some very, very bright people. I mean, I've had the honor of and privilege of working with some really excellent people. But in this changed scenario, government really should think that this human material can actually be put to much better use, rather than the manner in which they are stagnating for no fault of theirs. But you are expecting them to fight a 21st century information battle with 18th century weapons. It's not going to happen. So ultimately, because I was to speak about the role of the DIPR in the present context, my concluding recommendation, because I've gone on for far too long, is that we need to abolish the Ministry of Information Broadcasting, which my predecessor, Mr. Jaipal Reddy, when he entered office, was the first statement he made in 2004. Still the ministry continues, and you heard Mr. Venkaiah Naidu in the morning, who I feel is really enamored of his ministry, but that is another matter altogether. But, and similarly, the Department of Information and Public Relations, by whatever name it is called in the state governments, either needs to be abolished or a completely different reimagination of its role, scope, and canvas needs to be done.
Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences KISS, world's largest residential institute and home for 25,000 tribal children, including 15,000 girls, educating from KG to PG, a unique initiative for social transformation.